I guess that brings us to today's story, the piece that you just wrote for the Trace, and which was also published in the Atlantic, and it deals with the death, the suicide of somebody that I was good friends with, and that's where sort of the personal aspect of this comes in, and why I want to be upfront with the audience that this is going to be probably a bit different than our other podcasts because I have a personal connection to what's going on. I'd encourage people before we even start talking about the story to go and read it for themselves, because I'm obviously very closely connected to the story. And so that can affect how you perceive it, right? It's just reality. And so people should read for themselves the piece and make up their minds and form their own perspective on it. But we'll get into some of the thoughts that I had too. But why don't you just give us an overview in your own words here of your piece? It's a quite long investigative piece and it has a lot of interviews, including one with me quoted in there. But yeah, well, I just, in your own words, how would you summarize this new story?
Well, I think one thing that has routinely come up over the last 8 years as I started focusing on guns as a subject for reporting is just, and gun death in particular, is that most of it year in and year out is suicide, not homicide, which I think even now is still not widely understood. And that was something that was always in the back of my mind. And then in 2017, when Bob died by gun suicide, I was personally quite shocked by it, as so many other people were. I would say I very barely knew him. When we exchanged a couple of polite email exchanges, and I asked him a question or two for a story I wrote once. But I encountered him a lot on social media, like everybody else did. He was sort of a voice that you couldn't really ignore. It was just sort of like a powerful writer, and someone that sort of commanded your attention.
And for people who don't know Bob, obviously we knew him. I knew him really well. He was a good friend.
Yeah, he's a good friend.
And cared a lot for him. And his death was absolutely a surprise for a lot of us. But a very bad surprise. And but he was a writer. He ran Bearing Arms, which is part of Town Hall. It's a conservative publication about firearms, and so he was a prominent pro-gun writer, I guess would be a good way of describing what he did, at least for a living. Not who he was, but what he did.
I think, and so I had always been it seemed important, just as the years went on, to try as a reporter to have an understanding of what happened to Bob. If you were with the hope that it would provide a better understanding about the larger issue of suicide and who it was affecting and why. I mean, I didn't know that it would, and I don't even know that he as a person is an example of that, a representative example. Certainly a number of people close to him, including in the story, including his widow, Christine, doesn't view him that way. And I think it's important to think of everyone who dies, or just everyone as a human, to think of them as an individual person and not to sort of treat them as a symbol or something like that. But it seemed important to at least try, because we just knowing that we had this ongoing issue of the majority of gun death being suicide, and somehow that also being the aspect of gun death that gets ignored the most. What were we missing? What was I missing? What am I not understanding? I didn't understand a lot when I went into the story. And then as I started to look into Bob, or started to look into what happened, I should say, and that began with first getting, the investigation that surrounded the day that he passed down in North Carolina. It seemed important to also understand, or give the larger context, to what extent, for example, the gun industry itself had been engaged in suicide prevention efforts, which it had been, even before he died. And I felt like I had to get a sense, or get a really good sense of what those efforts consisted of, how, if it was even possible, one could determine the efficacy of those efforts. Did those efforts, were they at all potentially in conflict with what's required to be like a business that can continue to operate? So it was just more of like an open-ended inquiry. And then the result was, what's on the page, which is, me doing my best. I'm sure with shortcomings, as always happens when you produce a story, is trying to tell the story of Bob, not just how he died, but also to some extent how he lived. To show my primary concern with him was to the extent that I could, humanize him as much as possible. That really mattered to me, because I only had a one-dimensional view of Bob before, I started talking to people who knew him, because I only saw him on social media. I mean, this is what this is sort of what life is like now, unfortunately, with the internet and whatnot. So I wanted to understand if there was a trajectory, even from, his early life to where he wound up, what did that look like? Is, that's just, I guess, sort of how you tell a story. And then at the same time, tell the story of just this topic of research into the subject of gun suicide, which did sort of have an origin in the mid 80s, and then what evolved from there. And those seemed like the two narratives that were in conversation with each other. And and I did my best to braid them together, with the hope that there was something that could be learned. And again, while I may have not been fully successful, my goal was to be as inclusive as possible, to not try to suggest that there was some kind of panacea or great solution for this problem, or at least that's what I think. I can say now, that's what I think. So much is like, it's still, even now, even though it's been discussed a lot more, it's still like a pretty taboo subject. And I think, if nothing else, my hope was that it would potentially start some kind of broader, bigger, or more intense conversation where people could think about, again, thinking about Bob and how no one really expected this. It just like, that seemed important for people to understand and to think about their own lives and what could be done, for anyone as an individual, what, if any, precautions one might need to take to protect themselves if they're ever in a place, where they're suffering or struggling.